Hello, my friends, it's Elena Nikitina, and I'm going to read you the next chapter of my award-winning book, Girl Taken. I would really appreciate if you can write a comment, and thank you, as always, for listening to my story. It really means a world to me. So let's get started. Chapter 6, March 1995, Gurchuloy, Chechnya. Soon the car entered a village. The vehicle moved slowly along the muddy narrow road between rows of tightly packed houses. I was struck by the high green iron fences. The homes stood close to each other, and each house was protected by one of these iron barriers. Each of the fences was connected to the next, almost all of them painted green, and this made it seem like we were driving past one long wall of solid iron. Behind them, I could see the roofs of the houses covered with slate. From the ground to 3 feet up, everything was caked in dark gray dirt. I could only guess what was going on behind the high iron railings. The car stopped in front of one of the houses. Shorty jumped out of the car and quickly ran to the entrance. After a moment, the huge gates creaked open. The sound was loud, a shrieking of metal scraping the ground. Shorty pushed each one aside and let the car in. Once the car was inside the yard, he slammed them shut again. They were tall, much taller than he was. Once again, I was separated from the rest of the world, swallowed, this time, by a green iron monster. Hidden behind the massive fence, there was a nice red brick house, surrounded by a large yard. A woman appeared at the threshold of the house in a long dress with her hair covered. She looked imperious, like she was the ruler of this place. Our eyes met through the window glass, and I saw no kindness in them. Aslan's behavior and attitude towards me always changed, depending on who else was around. He was kind and compassionate when we were alone. I had been able to discover his hidden humanity during the past few weeks, but he was absolutely ruthless among other people. He turned to me and snapped, "Get out of the car!" The yard was full of people. The woman, Aslan, and Mirza led me inside the house. They talked among themselves in their own language while I stood waiting. I looked around the yard. If only I could convince Aslan to help me to escape. This town did not seem that wild or isolated. I might be able to find my way from here. This move could be a good sign. The house had no electricity. Like a huge octopus, the war had spread its tentacles everywhere. I followed the other three up the steps, down a dark corridor, into a kitchen dominated by a large wooden table. We passed through the kitchen into a room with sofas covered by colorful coverlets. The walls were decorated with woven Turkish rugs. The windows were covered with 2 layers of heavy drapes pushed to the sides. Underfoot I felt a soft pile wool carpet. It felt like home here, someone else's. It was going to be my prison. The next room seemed like someone's bedroom. The windows were flanked by delicate white curtains of sheer lace, the bed covered by a quilted bedspread, and there were colorful carpets on the walls and on the floor. After months of observing the ugly premises of the previous place, this home seemed loved and taken care of. The owners of the house were most likely a wealthy family. The door from this bedroom led to the back of the house. A small dark corridor led me to the most distant part of the house, where there was a tiny room, something like an oversized storage. It would be very dark in there, if not for a narrow window which let the morning light in. I realized immediately that this room was the end point, the place where I would stay. After a moment, I was left there alone. The window was very narrow, as if it's specially made to prevent the escape of a prisoner. However, I could look through it at a section of the yard. After the monotony of the apartment in Grozny, where I could not see anything through the black paint on the windows, looking through this window was like watching an anthill. From where I stood, I could see the yard with the summer kitchen enclosed by netting. Several fighters were sitting on the ground, resting. One woman was busy at the stove and setting the table. On the right in the distance, I could see the waddle and daub of the bathroom. I could see what I guessed was the well, and behind it a pile of firewood stacked near the fence. The yard was big and continued even further, out of my sight. Fortunately, even the narrow slit window let in quite a bit of light. It was nice to see natural daylight and watch how the morning came in. Along the opposite wall from the window there was a single bed. It seemed very old, with twisted iron bars at the head and at the foot. Exactly the same bed was once in my grandmother's house. The bed was in my bedroom when I was 4 or 5 years old. At that time, the mattress was on a large iron grid that always creaked. I did not like to sleep alone. Grandma came into my room every night when I stayed at her house and lay down close to me on the narrow bed. She told me fairy tales and stories that she composed herself. She spoke in a low and soothing voice and waited for me to fall asleep. Then she probably went to her own bedroom, but I had no idea about this because in the morning she came back and woke me up. My grandma's house was warm and always smelled delicious. In my grandmother's house there were a few large covered fireplaces that were used to warm the place. They were made of stones and went all the way to the ceiling, with tiny doors at the floor level where you could insert firewood. My grandfather was a fireplace builder by profession. In the winter, coming into the house from outside, it was so nice to lean against the warm fireplace and cuddle up in blankets, listening to the crackle of the burning firewood. Now this bed reminded me of those distant times when I felt loved and protected. This bed was covered with a red satin coverlet. A small bedside table between the wall and the bed and a kerosene lamp on the table completed the setup. 2 red pieces of carpet covered the floor. A patterned carpet hung over the bed. If it was not a prison cell, it would be quite a comfortable room. The only things missing were a tape recorder and the Gypsy King's cassette. I sat on the bed looking around. My body was still sore and aching after the fight with the Mujahideen, but I was very happy that I had left that sinister tomb. Even the pain seemed to me quite tolerable. After months in a dark and gloomy prison, this place was bright and somehow cozy. The carpets on the walls and on the floor created a sense of home. It was not even a full room, only half of it, with a leftover window. Some time ago this place had been separated by that wall, installed in the middle of what had once been a larger room. I could not think of another explanation for the odd shape and window placement. I tried to convince myself that I could escape from here. It would probably be easier than from the last place. Aslan came and left a large piece of pita bread and a 3-liter jar of canned fruit. It seemed like he knew the house well, so I showered him with questions about it. It turned out that the house belonged to the family of Mirza. Shorty himself, his mother, father, and younger sister lived here. His older brother, who had recently died in a war, had lived there too. Shorty's family provided the summer house and the yard for the use of militants and mercenaries. I was shocked by the idea that I was a prisoner in someone's home with the cooperation of someone's family. How strong the hatred for Russians must be if the mother and father have allowed a hostage held in their own home. I was encouraged when Aslan told me that no one would touch me while I was here. Of course, I doubted that Shorty would agree with this opinion, being the owner of the house. I would have to adapt to new conditions. The most difficult part seemed to be establishing my own semblance of a life and a schedule. I would need to find access to a toilet and the wash basin. My thoughts were interrupted by sounds coming from outside. A voice called, cutting through the silence, almost singing. There was something beautiful about it. and I sat listening, fascinated. It was the first time I heard the Muslim call to prayer, the muezzin cried from minaret. Cautiously, I looked out the little window. The militants began to prepare. There were a few of them, and I studied them through the narrow glass as they stopped whatever they were doing and readied themselves to give glory to their God. They all stood in the same direction and started to pray, oblivious to everything else. There was beauty and a strange attraction in the humble service. What did they ask of Allah? Did they pray for forgiveness? Was their guilty conscience tormented because they had warped someone's innocent life? Living behind a locked door side by side with the militants for months, I never had a chance to encounter their traditions. No wonder I wasn't staying with them as a student traveler to learn their way of life. I was their prisoner. The only feature of their lives I became familiar with, which I had to face and accept, was to use a pitcher to clean myself when I went to the bathroom. Now I could watch them closely and witness all that they did. They were ardent followers of their religion and patriots of their country. During the Second World War, the Russian people had defended their country against the attacks of fascism. It hadn't occurred to anyone to condemn them for it. Why had the Russian government decided that such a freedom-loving people as the Chechens would surrender without a fight and would welcome an invasion from the outside? They would fight while they were still alive, or until the ones for whom the war was profitable ceased receiving dividends from all the blood. Suddenly the door opened and there was Mirza. He was unarmed. I backed away from the window and prepared to take his taunts. He leaned on the stately iron headboard. "Listen carefully," he said. "There are new rules. You will be able to go out of this room 3 times a day, in the morning, at midday, and in the evening. You'll be called when it's time. So stick to the schedule. You won't be here for long. Behave calmly and politely." He enjoyed his newfound importance. I thought back to how he had tortured me with his words and to my humiliation at being struck by him. "I would like to go out now, can I?" He shook his head. "It's not time yet. Later." Why did I even think about asking him this question? If he was not able to threaten me with a gun in my face in this house, then he would certainly choose another convenient way to humiliate me. Once again, he hurt my feelings, and he did it masterfully. Outside the window the morning came, bright and sunny, one of those that's supposed to fill you with joy and happiness. Sun broke over the horizon and lit up the whole earth with the power and energy of the new day. The warm rays of light penetrated through the small window and forced my eyes to squint. How I would love to go right now into the new day with an open heart and dive into the freshness of the morning to wash my face with cool dew and wake up from my long nightmare. But my relationship with the world has been violated. And knocked askew. A new sunny day no longer overwhelmed me with creative energy, but instead made me suffer from poisonous helplessness and bitterness. I looked out the window. I watched the life and concerns of other people through the glass, like I was living their lives instead of my own. In my previous place of confinement, in the isolation of the black room, I could keep aloof and live in my own thoughts, dreams, and memories. This place was turning out to be more brutal. It was unbearable to see that the world had not collapsed, but continued on, with me simply deleted from it. I wanted my own life back. I wanted freedom. Here there were no war sounds. It was as if there was not a war at all. Only the group of bearded mujahideen outside in the yard reminded me that somewhere very near the bloodshed continued. I still had enough luck to get out into the fresh again, very briefly. The key in the lock turned, and Shorty opened the door. He was back. I had not heard his footsteps. The carpets on the floor hid the noise from me. "Let's go now," he said. He ordered me rather than told me. Any action was better than sitting and grieving over my unhappy fate, and I had to explore my new routine and the way to the toilet. I followed Shorty back through the tiny dark hallway, through the small cozy bedroom, and the large room with sofas and carpets. All the rooms were drowned in the sunlight pouring through the large windows. I wondered if there were iron grills on windows. From the hall he led the way into the kitchen. This time I noticed a few rooms located to the left of the kitchen. One of them looked like a dining room. Shorty took me out the same way that we came in during the early morning, to the right, through a dark corridor, and outside onto the porch. A fresh and warm breeze blew in my face, enveloped me, and carried me away for a moment into distant memories. There, when we traveled as a family on a snow-white ship down the river during one of our summer vacations. There, when we were standing on the deck and a warm wind blew over our faces with pleasant river air as we sailed past breathtaking landscapes. Back then, the happiness had no limits. The yard was crowded. The tall green iron fence securely hid what was happening. Next to the gate there was a car, a military jeep, the one I was brought in. The summer house was full of militants. I already knew where the toilet was. From my little window, I could see the gray structure of the latrine. I tried not to look at the people. I did not want to attract even the slightest attention. I walked without making a single sound. I glanced around rapidly, keeping my head down as I moved toward the toilet. Shorty went ahead, leading the way, and turned around the corner of the house. "Here is the wash basin." The wash basin was attached to the wall, and next to it there was a huge barrel filled to the brim with water. Its top was open and a pipe extended down to it, collecting rainwater from the roof. The women were washing clothes in a large basin. This was the back of the house, which was completely hidden and not visible from my tiny window. On the ground there was a row of vessels. I picked up one. I already knew the routine. Now I had learned the path that I would walk 3 times a day, if I was lucky. After a while, Shorty took me back through the house to my room and turned the key in the lock. Long hours in anguish and loneliness dragged by. During the past 6 months, I had been sick from memories of the past. I lay still, in the grips of an acute homesickness. I was overcome by malaise, a way I had never been in my life. So vivacious, so carefree, so young, so in love with life, that was the Lena I knew. But now, the present was lost to me. I could barely move. I could barely carry out the simplest act. I only survived by dreaming of the future. To my credit, I did not let feelings of hopelessness destroy me. I pressed on, I persisted. I constantly thought about my mom, of how much I loved her, of so many good times we'd had in the past, of our reunion, and the good times we would have in the future. We would remain side by side, inseparable, until the end of our days. But each time I thought of her, it felt like a little bit more of my soul bled from my body. I would turn white from all the bleeding. She did not know if I was alive, and she was going through these months as alone as I was. I knew her character. She would not find solace in human pity, so she would suffer in solitude. These thoughts hurt me, and my emotional torture was such that it turned into physical pain. I felt a sharp ache in my chest, like a butcher's knife had penetrated my sternum and cut out not just my heart, but also my lungs. It seemed that I could no longer breathe. Sometimes I really did feel that I was dying. I would lie in bed for hours and think I'm dying. It did not make sense. Dying of what? Of cancer? Of heart disease? No, not heart disease, but heartbreak. In those moments, I would be happy to die, to simply wither away, diminish, fall asleep, and never wake up. It seemed like the best thing that could happen. But then the feeling would fade. It might take hours or days, and I would begin to return to something I could recognize as myself. I was still here, still alive, and that meant I must press on, find a way to survive, and maybe one day escape into sunlight and safety and freedom. The days looked exactly the same and replaced each other one by one. Even after the long months in prison, I could not stop thinking about the salvation, whether it came as an escape or rescue from the outside. I believed that the day would come. I needed a plan and an accomplice. I needed Aslan. I could not do it without him. Hoping for the police to arrive was a dead end. They never turn up in the midst of an apocalypse to save one person. They would wait for the end of the war. I couldn't wait. I had to leave. At dawn, the guttural voice of the muezzin echoed over the surrounding area from the tower of the minaret. The early morning call to prayer. The militants stopped what they were doing and began to perform ritual ablutions. They washed their faces, hands and feet, and rolled up their trousers legs to mid-calf. They prayed for the salvation of their souls several times a day. If I saw them praying in the courtyard through my window, I always watched the process carefully. The militants lined up neatly in a row, kneeling, prostrating, standing, moving in unison, an amazing display of the togetherness and intimacy and brotherhood of the Muslim people. Aslan came to see me almost every evening. Mostly he stayed for just a few minutes. Sometimes he was able to stay longer, and increasingly he was willing to answer my questions. It seemed to me he enjoyed my company. I found out that he lived in the same village and was friends with Shorty since their childhoods. They were both 25. Through Aslan, I got hold of a book, which made me unspeakably happy. Now I could kill time. I asked him to bring me any book, the thickest he could find. He brought me Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, which he chose from the modest library of Mirza's family. When I was in school, we tried in vain to understand the meaning of this difficult psychological novel. I did not finish reading it then. It was too weird and tedious for my taste, but I did not mind trying my luck again. Aslan would quietly creep to my room, scratching at the door, coming in with a smirk on his face into the dark room, lit dimly by the kerosene lamp. He sat down carefully, one leg tucked underneath, leaning against the open metal headboard as he told me stories about the war. He also asked me about my life and my childhood. I saw he was enjoying his time with me, more so with each passing day. If not for the fact that he was one of the terrorists, I could have considered him my spiritual friend. Any time I told him about my life before captivity, it made my imprisonment feel all the more acute by bringing back my sweet and dear memories of the past. I could not hold back and wept in front of him. "Let me go, Aslan. Our family does not have the money. You will never get the ransom. It makes no sense to keep me here. Please, let me go." He comforted me as a big brother or a friend, but he was adamant. I begged him to help me to escape, but he always answered the same. "You are not my prisoner. I don't have the power to decide." I was not the only one kidnapped and held in Chechnya. Aslan told me heart-rending stories about the other hostages, brutal stories about how the Chechen militants cut off the heads of the hostages, skewered them on stakes, and put them on public display to intimidate the others. He told me about a concentration camp that was operating in one of the villages, a story which brought me to tears. Prisoners who no one gave a ransom for were forced to build roads. Many of them were tortured in front of the others to create a climate of fear. Some of the unwanted were simply shot. Aslan told stories of the horrors of the war and the fate of the prisoners of war and hostages. It plunged me into shock. I could expect the same fate for myself. But according to him, the most inhuman and bloodthirsty villains of his stories were, of course, the Russian troops. He talked about the torture and mass killing of innocent Chechen civilians, abuse of detainees, and the burning of houses, all done by Russians. The outrages would begin immediately after they took a village. The murder of innocent people was swift and terrible. Punishment for the continuing resistance of the Chechen fighters. A war, it was the cruelest thing in the world. Their war was large-scale, violent and bloody, coupled with pain, misfortune and loneliness. They were fighting for freedom and ideology. My war was the struggle of one soldier, and also coupled with pain, misfortune and loneliness. And I was fighting for freedom and survival. I was no longer afraid of Aslan. The more I saw him, the more I brought up the topic of my escape. I jokingly tried to discuss a plan that I could carry out with his help, gently probing the soil. What if you left the gate unlocked? Do you think that would work? I could try to silently go out the gate unnoticed in the dark on the way back from the bathroom. I offered him humorous escape options, trying to catch his mood about it. He brushed aside each of the options I offered him, but he did not reject the overall idea of an escape. He played along with me, and for each idea I gave him, he gave me a good reason why it would never work. Our game amused him. You would not get too far. Outside of these gates there are 100 more houses, just like this one. You will be noticed immediately and caught. You will be sold to Wahhabis as a slave, or beheaded in the public square. There are a lot of people around here who would love to avenge their lost loved ones. I wanted to believe that Aslan was not just trying to scare me, but was also trying to find the right way out. He wanted to help me. Only he couldn't admit it right now. I did not know the location of the house, but I could not hear the sound of the war. The front had not yet reached this village. The militants would leave the premises in small groups of 3 or 4 people, and then would come back. The gates opened manually. The sound was unpleasant and lingered in the air afterward. Aslan went to fight mostly in the daytime. I never knew if he would come back in the evening. He always came back. I finished reading the Dostoevsky. The book was a dark philosophical argument about the conscience, sin, and redemption. The main point was that, for whatever reason, the offender has committed a crime, especially murder, and must be punished, serving life in prison to suffer and repent of their deeds. The women of the house were everywhere and nowhere at the same time. They appeared suddenly and silently, like ghosts, and disappeared just as quietly. I felt their presence in everything, but I rarely saw their faces. I often saw them from the back, quickly scurrying around the yard. They were busy preparing food, doing household chores, and cleaning. They never sat at the dining table under the tent with the men. Shorty's mother was a little woman, nimble and plump. His sister was a thinner version of her mother. The way she walked and moved was the same, and her physique was the same, but she was more petite. Both wore long dresses and handkerchiefs tied around their heads, with their hair tucked underneath. I fleetingly encountered the mother in the kitchen a few times. I wanted to talk with one of the women and maybe ask for help, but I could not find an opportunity. Since they were female, I thought I could find a way to appeal to reason, but they did not pay any attention to me. I was totally ignored. They showed neither pity nor interest. I could even understand it a bit, They had the fresh wound of losing a son and a brother at the hands of the Russian army. Still, Shorty's mother was an almost imperceptible but undeniable part of my life. Every day she woke at dawn and immediately set to work. Through Aslan, I asked permission from her as the mistress of the house to have a chance to wash my hair and take a shower. My request was accepted. On the appointed evening, Shorty took me into place, a small extension at the back of the house. Someone warmed the water for me and carefully brought it into the shower in a bucket. I filled another bucket with cold water from a huge rainwater barrel near the shower cabin by myself. I poured the warm and pleasant water from the bucket on my body using a small can, very carefully and neatly, trying to enjoy the limited water a small amount at a time. At such moments of simple human happiness, even if it's fleeting, everything that was outside the thin shower walls ceased to exist. The lukewarm water flowed from the top of my head right through the goosebumps all over my body, down to my feet. The whole process was uncomfortable, but at the same time it was beautiful. I exposed my body, and I bared my soul, greedily gasping for water. The water had the magical ability to wash the mental stress away, if only for a few moments. Now I felt like I was able to breathe again and go on living. I was grateful for the opportunity to take a shower and also a scarf that Shorty's mother passed to me through Shorty. I didn't know this woman, but I wanted to believe that she was sorry for me in her heart. I was trying to convince myself there are no people without compassion. Outside my window, it rained for a few days in a row. The gray dust of the yard turned into brown mud. Early morning, Mirza brought me back into the house after my usual trip to the bathroom. I was in my dress, soaked by the torrential downpour outside. His mother was in the kitchen, preparing food. She said a couple of words to Shorty in Chechen, and he said something to her in response. She glanced at me. For the second time I met her eyes. The first time was when I thought her evil eyes burned me through the glass of the car window on the day when they brought me here. "You can sit here," she said. She spoke Russian. I was surprised by the timbre of her voice. It was low, masculine, and with a thick accent. She spoke quietly and pointed to a stool in the corner. Shorty went out into the corridor, leaving wet footprints from his boots on the wooden kitchen floor. I took her words as an invitation to stay in the kitchen with her, in the place that was her kingdom. I sat down very gingerly on the stool and stared at her in the gray light coming from the window on this wet and nasty morning. Her tired and weathered face was lined with deep wrinkles. A bright kerchief was tied around her head very low, almost covering her dark and bushy eyebrows. She quickly sifted flour through a sieve. She did everything so fast that it seemed that she was born with these skills, or had done it all a million times. Her strong, work-worn hands quickly kneaded the dough with habitual gestures. She covered the entire table with white flour, and her face, a mask of concentration, started to roll out thin layers of dough. She placed them on each other, smudging butter between each layer. As if by magic, before my eyes she turned the dough into a big round layered pita, ready to bake. It was not simple cooking. What I observed was an art at which she was a master. Shorty came back for me and took me out of the kitchen. The kerosene lamp slowly smoked the room, illuminating a space around itself in yellow and warm light. At nightfall, all human feelings are more intense. The world outside the window became silent and lived its mysterious life. I looked at the man sitting in front of me. With time, during our brief meetings, I began to understand Aslan. He was cruel, uncompromising, and strong. He was wild with medieval manners. But he was also somehow merciful. His language was economical. Even while telling a story, he used few words. He spoke in the simplest possible language, without flourishes of any kind. Was it because he did not have enough of the Russian language, or because of the peculiarities of the Chechen character? It was time for the night prayer. Aslan left the room and returned in a few minutes later, his trouser legs rolled up to his mid-calves, barefoot, with the prayer rug under his arm. He did not say a word to me, but I knew what he was going to do. He spread the mat on the floor, then directed his attention toward Mecca in adoration of Allah, and began to pray in front of me. In the twilight of the kerosene lamp, his movements fascinated me. He began standing, then bowed, straightened up again, and then fell to his knees in prostration, with his forehead touching the ground. He produced mysterious hand movements, and then touched his face. He whispered delightfully in prayer, and it seemed that this was the highest level of intimacy. He was revealing himself to me. Either he thought I was a close friend, or he wanted me to become one. I did not share his faith in this being Allah. I no longer knew what I believed in, but I could see the profound splendor in his relationship with his God, or demon, or figment of his own imagination. It ennobled him, and perhaps was the source of his undeniable courage. I watched him in awe, silently sitting on the bed, soaking in his peace and enjoying the simple grace of his movements and the beauty of what was happening. What are you showing me, Aslan? Why are you inviting me to witness this? It had been more than 6 months since I was last home. 6 long months. I was cut off from the familiar world so long ago that I had begun to get used to the local way of life, the existence of a captive gradually dominated by consciousness. My life was determined by my environment. I had to somehow organize my life, even being in the prison. A person is able to endure all that she faces, except death. My consciousness built a barricade around itself and no longer let fear or any emotion get through it. The will to live, the strongest human instinct, adapted to any conditions. The constant feeling of despair eventually dulled and blocked the stress, and forced me to live in spite of everything. I was carried on the waves of my worthless life, like a ship without sails, driven by the wind with no resistance. Day after day and month after month, so passed my life, in chains and shackles. Aslan told me a little about the war. Both sides were suffering heavy casualties. Russian forces were seizing the large settlements, town by town. The militants were not appeased. They retreated to the mountains and fought a guerrilla war. The Russian heavy artillery had moved to the foothills, trying to get militants out of mountains. In Chechnya, there were 2 bosses now. During the daylight, Russian troops controlled the country. Their numbers were vast, and they enjoyed the full might of the Red Army: airplanes, bombs, tanks, missiles, radar. Their dominance could hardly be challenged, and yet, when darkness came, the Chechen fighters crawled from their holes in the ground and took up their weapons. They owned the night, making sniper attacks on Russian patrols, firing rocket-propelled grenades at Russian positions, killing sentries silently in hand-to-hand combat, laying mines, sabotaging bridges and roads. They knew all the secret trails in the mountains where they were raised. They struck where they were least expected. They knocked helicopters from the sky. They destroyed entire troop convoys. Small groups of men did this, most often on foot, moving stealthily and without a sound, dancing with death, their own and that of the Russians. Just before the sun rose, they would arrive in villages like this one, disappear into the cabins, and descend back down into the bowels of the earth. The Chechen people had long ago chosen the wolf as their symbol. To them, the wolf stands for independence and freedom. But the wolf has other meanings as well. The wolf is a nocturnal animal, and it hunts under cover of darkness. It is cunning, it is sly, and it is well known to work the herd with senseless cruelty. Wolves will slaughter all of the cattle in a field, consume what they can, then leave the rest to rot, a feast for the crows and the vultures. Wolves will murder like this again and again until men with guns come and put a stop to it. The darkness of the night came down, and Aslan appeared in a new military vest, an improved version made by his mother. It was the conventional military vest of Russian troops that she perfected by sewing on a lot of pockets and added details. Now he could hold a lot more grenades and rounds on it. Aslan enthusiastically showed me the advantages of the vest in the soft light of the kerosene burner. He spoke rapidly, in the excitement, describing to me his extraordinary waistcoat, as if to distract me from what was more important. We stood close to each other, considering all the convenient pockets for combat grenades. He tried not to look me in the eye, and his face was very serious in the dim lamplight. I already knew that he wanted to say something important. Suddenly, he stopped talking and picked up the lamp, lighting my face. His shining black eyes stared right into my own eyes, with their usual ability to drill down to my soul. But this time they were not cruel. He raised his other hand to my face and held it against my cheek with a long touch. There was grief in his face. "You will never go home." My heart stopped beating. "You are going on a mission." The words sounded like a death sentence. I did not want to know anything about this mission. I was afraid to ask. I did not want to hear the answer. I would go insane with misery. The tears fell from my eyes. I could not hide them. Aslan softly grabbed me by the neck and put my head on his shoulder. He hugged me with his hand and held me close. I was crying and could not stop. He patted me on the back, soothing me. He whispered in my ear, "I will come tomorrow, and we will figure out how to get you home." He loosened his arms from me and quietly left me alone. But the next day he did not come, and for a few days after that he also did not appear. I hadn't seen Mirza either. Something had happened. Their sudden disappearance gave me a premonition of trouble. The feeling would not leave me. Mission. Mission? What did he mean? I had been thinking about it all the time since he left. I was panicking because of his absence. He promised to help me. Tomorrow I may not be here anymore. But now, knowing that he would help me, I could finally think how to implement a plan to escape. As soon as he reappeared, I would not waste any more time and run away at the first opportunity, a suitably dark night. Aslan will distract the fighters and leave the gate unlocked. The gates need to be well lubricated. The scraping sound they make is loud and terrible. I will have to open the gates silently and quietly get out of the house. I'll have to go through the village quietly so no one else pays attention to me. I need a dark handkerchief. I need money to get out of the village on a passing car. I could pretend to be deaf and dumb and show a note to the driver that Aslan would write in advance. When Aslan came, I would tell him about my plan, and together we would work out the details. I did not know what was going on behind the iron fence. He would tell me what to do. Maybe he would take me out of the village by himself and bring me closer to the Russian encampments. Aslan was still the enemy, but he was also my only way out, my only friend. I knew that the war and his ideology were everything to him, a matter of honor, but I was sure that together we could come up with a suitable plan and do it before I had to fulfill my mission, which I was afraid to ask about. I was sure he would not allow anything bad to happen to me. I was sure that he had intense feelings about me. These long months had brought us closer together. I waited for his return. I listened to all the sounds wafting through the door, trying to catch the hissing sound of his voice. I kept looking out the window. The creaking of the opening gates made me hold my breath, waiting to see his face. I needed him. Late at night, someone knocked on the door. Instantly, I woke up in alarm. The door was unlocked from the outside, and there was the shorty's mother in the doorway holding the lantern, illuminating her face. She looked evil in the dim light. She stared at me, her eyes gleaming, her eyes shooting sparks, eyes that made me want to shrink away from her. "You are leaving right now," she said. "Get up, you are being taken to another place." I was still half asleep. I did not quite understand what she was talking about. She had a strong accent, but she was noticeably happy to say these words. I saw it, and I felt it with a goose flesh on my own skin. Aslan, he must be somewhere near. Where is Aslan? Is he here? "No more Aslan," she said. "He's gone. The Russians killed him." They killed him. My vision blacked out for a second. I nearly fainted from dizziness. I was numb, in a stupor. I could not understand what I had to do at that moment. I will be taken away? Where? No more Aslan? No more Aslan. I could not see any more. My eyes dimmed with tears. With trembling hands, I began to quickly gather my simple belongings. Everything that Aslan kindly brought me. Toothpaste and toothbrush, a comb, wool-knitted socks, and a small towel. I pulled a few remaining pads out from under the pillow and a pair of spare underwear. I dropped all items into a square handkerchief, the one that Shorty's mother had given me. I put all the stuff in the center of it and tied the edges to make a bag. I sat on the edge of the bed waiting. He's dead. He's been killed. No more Aslan. I could not imagine it. I just could not believe it. My life was over. I could not handle the death of Aslan. The tears did not stop for a minute. I mourned his death along with all my dead hopes. He was a good person, in fact, the only one who reached out to me, as far as it was possible, and gave me a helping hand. My last chance for salvation had died with him. I could no longer hope for anything. Aslan was my only defender, and he was going to get me out of captivity. He was about to help me. I needed just a few more days. The thought that my plan was slowly progressing gave me the strength to live on. Now I was lost. Everything that I had planned for so long and cherished had collapsed and turned into ashes. I was devastated. I didn't have the strength to look for a new way out. This was the end. I could not take it anymore. I was emaciated, and I was on the verge of insanity. It had been so long since I was captured and destroyed. I was no longer even sure if the life that I remembered, that I had before captivity, was really a true thing, and not just my dreams or a fiction. Maybe I had already gone insane, and I had never lived in a different world. All my life I was in captivity. This is my life. I had reached the limit of my strength. In almost 8 months, I had stayed strong up to this point. I could not endure it any longer. It had to stop. The end of the chapter. Thank you for listening. Please don't forget to write a comment, like this video, and subscribe to my channel. See you next time. Stay well.